Hi, Misha here, and lately a few Mausers have come in, and a new one here I wanted to show you. But at the same time, I wanted to talk about other very similar ones. These are all large ring, and these are all kind of the last of the breed. They all started off in other chamberings, but in the late 50s, early 60s, they were reworked to fire the, at the time, very new 7.62 NATO 7.62 by 51 cartridge, commonly known as 308 Winchester. So, I don't know, I thought it'd be kind of fun to look at the last generations of these bolt action rifles. On the top we have the Israeli, in the middle we have the Chilean, and at the bottom, hard to mistake, we have the Spanish. So, while this may be a bolt action video, it is a bolt action of the highest quality, Mauser, firing what is still today considered a modern, current, effective cartridge. First off, before we dive in too deep, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd really like to help out the channel, you might check out the link to the Patreon page. These kind of old bolt action videos I really enjoy making, but let's be honest with each other, they don't get the most views and, if anything else, interaction in the comments. But as I always say, I encourage you to give it a go. You might find these more interesting than you would think, because they're of the Cold War era, and they did see military action in the 1960s. So with that said, these are all large ring Mausers, more or less based on the Model 98 pattern. So they're cock on open, and they have a 5-round internal double stack magazine, and they all are in short rifle configuration. The Israeli has about a 23.5-inch barrel, the Chilean slightly longer at 24 inches, and our Spanish here, it's the shortest at roughly 18 inches. But they have the same safety systems and are all kind of the same general idea, to make what would have been considered an obsolete gun by this era still usable, at least for training, second line troops, emergency use, also possibly DMR, or light sniper rifle. With that said, let's dive in and begin with the newest gun here, the Chilean Modelo 1912/61. And these are actually built on the oldest actions by, well, the company we know is Steyr today. It was OEWG back then, before World War I, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was a major arms builder. And they were building Mauser pattern rifles alongside DWM, and FN Herstal. And Chile had already purchased large numbers of the Model 1895 in 7x57 7mm Mauser. By 1910 and 11, they were looking to update and upgrade those, as well as purchase new guns. And there was some back and forth with DWM and OEWG, Steyr, and ultimately Steyr would get the contract. CN Arsenal has done quite a bit of work on the drama, the soap opera that was. But in the end, Steyr would get it, and between 1912 and 1914, they would deliver a good number to the Chileans, It seems like the most common numbers are 37,500 rifles, that would be with a 29-inch barrel, and 5,600 carbines, that would be with a barrel just over 18 inches. And then pretty standard Mauser guns. The original Model 1912, as it was known, was very much like others, the Brazilians and DWM's exports. They have a semi-pistol grip stock, a flat steel butt plate. One neat feature, they have the QD sling swivel found on the commission rifle and some Model 98s. 5-round internal mag, standard trigger and safety. The receivers were left in the white, although during refurbishment many were blued. Pretty standard rear sight, medium length upper handguard, high quality wood stocks on these. They even had the reinforcing lug that earlier models like the 1895 did not. Moving forward, they had the sling swivels on the bottom for the rifles and on the side for carbines. And one interesting thing, they had this H-band with the bayonet lug. This is a very strong assembly, and you see it on the Gewehr 98, and it has this so-called parade hook under it, which is kind of identifiable, and no front sight protector is fixed to the base. Again, though, this is of course a rechamber. Flipping over, we have a cleaning rod under the barrel, but it's actually a very short rod. It does not go very deep into the stock for this variant, probably because of the cut down nature of it. We have standard capture screws and main screws under here. And we have the always attractive stock disc. Who doesn't like those? It's just classy. So that was the original version in 7mm. Of course, deliveries would stop with World War I, and Chile would go on from there. They would purchase some more versions from Mauser in the 1930s, the M35, but our purpose today, in the very early 60s, as they were switching over to 7.62 NATO, they were using it in the SIG SG 510-4 variant of the Sturmgewehr 57. They also had a few FALs. Those were the frontline guns, though. For reservists and training, and just because they had these guns and the receivers built strong and still had some life in them, they would rechamber them, or rather rebarrel them. Now, one thing about this action, it doesn't hold open on an empty. They did put a spacer in the magwell up front here, because of course this is 6mm shorter. As for the barrel, you could force 7.62 NATO to fire from a 7mm barrel. In fact, there were some of the older 1895s that were done just that way, but considering those were small ring Mausers and everything, they're not generally considered safe to fire. These are rebarreled with modified 30-06 barrels, modified to 7.62 NATO. It's said, take it as you will, that they were leftover Springfield 1903 or 1903 A3 barrels, which would actually account for a lot of things. It's even said that they are often the 2-groove version from World War II. Either way, these are 600mm, 24 inches long, which means they're slightly longer than the Chilean short rifle, the 95 short rifle, and just a good in-between length. They would shorten the stocks, rebarrel them, and apparently they were very high-quality guns, perfectly safe to fire with 7.62 NATO, because, again, large ring 98 style action with the full lugs. Although, if you find a Chilean 95 chambered for 7.62 NATO, that's questionable. 308, I wouldn't. Up to you. People argue online, have done for years. I wouldn't risk it. personal preference. You do you, though. I don't know how many of these were converted. Probably not a huge number, considering they did not have more than 40 some odd thousand to begin with, and I'm sure some of them were worn out over the years. But 10 or 20,000 might have been converted. Hard to say. But I've had these in the shop in the past. Never kept one, and thought, well, when another one finally comes in, it's kind of neat to hang on to. I like Steyr guns. I have gotten more into South American Mausers over the years. You've seen the Argentines. And since I've got the 95, I thought, why not? As far as the quality, these are nice guns. The original Steyrs were well made, amongst the best Mauser actions, and the rebarreling and reworking of the action for NATO cartridge was top quality. So, really can't knock them. Neat guns. Quite possibly the most famous 7.62 Mauser in America, the Israeli. Don't really know a designation from this except for maybe P18, which is kind of a code name used. And the Israeli Mauser kind of predates Israel itself. The Haganah, the Israeli freedom fighters looking for a state, started obtaining old, well, not old at the time, they're actually brand new in some cases, 1944, 1945 production, Mausers from the collapsed Third Reich in 1945, 1946. This would be the first batch. These were clandestine, smuggled into Israel, or Palestine at the time. And the first kind of unofficial batch was actually from Czechoslovakia. Believe it or not, in 1947, Stalin was in favor of a free and independent Israel, a Jewish state in the Middle East, because at that time, Egypt and others were closely aligned with the West, thanks to their connection with Britain. So, basically, the Soviets ordered Czechoslovakia to supply the Israelis with weapons, including rifles. Now, Czechoslovakia had built the Mauser under German occupation, as well as their own excellent VZ-24, and they continued to refurbish guns from the war, as well as receive some from the Soviet Russians that they were to repackage and ship out under their name. And they even built some using leftover parts and a few new production parts between 1946 and 1949. So, yeah, Czechoslovakia was kind of one of the happening places for 98 style guns. And in January of 1948, the first kind of under-the-table deal was struck with the Israelis. This was because the British were still nominally in control there, and there was an embargo. So the first rifles, about 4,500, maybe 5,000, were delivered in March and April of 1948. Even when the British left by May, there was still a UN embargo in the region, so it still wasn't really legal. Nevertheless, between that time and October of that year, they delivered nearly 35,000 guns from the Czechs. And these could be German wartime guns, they could be Czech post-war guns, they could be built with a mix and match of this and that, however it goes. And not exactly legal, yeah. The actual first legal patch, truly so, came in 1950 when the new Israeli government went into negotiations with Fabrique Nationale in Belgium to build them all new production guns. Previously, they had guns that were either used or built from used parts. No, these would be the first guns built specifically for the Israelis. I think they kind of liked the FN guns after picking up a few of the Ethiopians the previous year, which were Model 24s, maybe some Model 30s, made by FN. They also had a small number of Swedish M40 Mausers. You get the idea. The takeaway, these were all 8mm guns. The Swedish were 8mm by 63, but still 8mm. And, yeah. The FN guns were delivered, again, brand new, between 1952 and 1953. Now, some speculate that the FNs were actually in 7.62 NATO. I don't see how this could be. For one, 7.62 NATO was not adopted until 1954. Even the commercial Winchester 308 was not put onto the market until 1952. More importantly for Israel, they did not select the FAL until 1955. No, everything I've seen, the FN guns were 8mm, just as the Czech guns. And you can tell this is a Czech gun because of the large trigger guard and a few other features. But it really doesn't matter, because when they started doing the 7.62 NATO conversions in 1956, they kind of just disassembled the guns, reworked them, cleaned them, refurbished them, refinished them, threw all the parts back in the bin and put them back together. So you'll see a mixed match of all kinds of things. Luckily for them, a few years earlier they had obtained a K98 production line, and they even toyed with the idea of building all new rifles for themselves, but they had enough used ones and these were on the way out. They decided not to, but they were able to utilize the tooling to make parts that they needed. Like I said, beginning in 1956, they started doing some reworks for the new cartridge, but it was pretty low-key until about 1958, 1959. Then they would ramp up, and they would actually continue to rebuild and convert guns all the way through 1967. So they would make brand new barrels in Israel for 7.62 NATO. They would often make brand new beechwood stocks. You can tell by the finger grooves, pretty unique. You'll see a lot of Krieg's model parts, like this one has the welded bands, but they would also do things like add the spring. It's kind of a whole thing. Has the bayonet lug. Sometimes they would use them with K98 bayonets. Other times they would make their own bayonet. The Israeli version has a muzzle ring, whereas the German would not. These guns would have the receiver crest, and they would be marked 7.62 NATO on the receiver, or at least 7.62, and more importantly, the buttstock has it very prominently branded into the bottom, so it would not be confused with 8mm. Again, no real hard and fast rules considering how these were put together, but the conversions were well done. Again, we have a standard Mauser bolt. We have a spacer, different pattern than on the Chilean, but still a spacer here in the front. This does hold open on empty because of the pattern used. And as you note, it has a turn down bolt with the corresponding recess in the stock. Now these definitely saw combat. Early on, the 8mm versions were used extensively front line during the independence, 1948-49. They were starting to fall kind of second line during the Suez Crisis, 1956. And by 1967, with the Six-Day War, some second line troops and auxiliary troops were sent to the front with these rechambered versions. The last time that the IDF put these in the field, either using it as DMR or second line kind of PDW type things, was the Yom Kippur War in 1973. And after that, they were pretty much pulled out of frontline service, being declared obsolete by 1980. Some we have in America came straight from Israel. Others were actually sent to Guatemala. The earliest Israeli Mausers were sent there in 1957, but it was a small number. Another small batch was sent around 1967. And then after they were declared surplus to needs, large numbers were sent to Guatemala in the late 70s and early 80s, alongside some IMI Galils that had been purchased. So others we find in America actually came via South America. These can be in rough shape. And even the Israeli guns can have some wear and tear because there's a chance they saw real combat in the desert. And often they'll have it blued or a phosphated finish or a mix of both. Again, there are no hard and fast rules with the Israeli K98s because they built them using all kinds of base guns as well as parts of their own creation. But it's a high quality gun, dependable, perfectly safe for 7.62 NATO, and just really of great interest to American collectors or Middle East collectors, anyone, because they were there. They were been there and done that, and as many know, more than a few still bear their Waffen amps, believe it or not. It's said that they were always crossed out. This is definitely not true, because I had them that had the Waffen amps still intact, for what that's worth. And with that, let's move on to our third and final gun today. Well, the Chilean might be built on the oldest receiver, and the Israeli might be the most famous, but the Spanish FR8 is certainly the most unique looking, and in some ways the most radical. The FR8 is built on the Spanish model 1943 action, M43 action, which was a near exact version of the German K98. Had a few differences though, like the side sling bar and the bottom swivel instead of the pass-through. Pretty well. Large ring, straight bolt, yada yada yada. It originally had the 23.5-inch barrel, but of course was reworked. Now the FR7 was built on the older 93 or 1916 small ring action, but yeah, the FR8 was built on the large ring. And these would be produced in Spain in 8mm in the original version up through the early 50s. The FR7s and FR8s would not start appearing until at least 1955, 1956. Again, it's sometimes been reported that they were done earlier. Based on the time that the cartridge was adopted and what was going on in Spain, this does not seem likely, because around 1951-52, Spain had not even selected 7.62 SETME, the lower power version of the cartridge. They were still working with a 7mm by 40 round, and the earliest prototypes and everything were just coming underway. They didn't even have the SETME Model A rifles until 1955, if you get what I'm saying, and those were firing the 7.62 SETME round. It's pretty common that the FR7s are good for that, but the FR8s are perfectly fine for 7.62 NATO. Good, solid action. But at any rate, these were converted over in the late 50s, possibly into the 60s. They were for training and second-line use, and often could be found in the hands of the police, the Civil Garda. So they certainly saw issuance amongst the countryside, cavalry maybe, second-line units, all the way through the 70s, some say even into the 80s. And this is a pretty interesting and wild rework to fire the new cartridge. Originally, the 43 fired 8mm, but this is, of course, firing the NATO round. At the heart of any good conversion is the barrel, and this is essentially a SETME Model B barrel. It even uses a triple frame of sorts, but it kind of flips things around on the SETME rifle. The barrels on the bottom, the cocking tubes in the middle, and the sights at top. This has been flipped with the barrel in the middle. The front side is still fully protected, and it's adjustable for with a tool there. The barrel is short, like on a SETME. We have a removable flash hider muzzle device that can also double as a 22mm standard NATO launcher if you need to. And we have this tube down here that acts as a bayonet lug. Takes a standard SETME rifle bayonet, and the SETME rifle has a small tube in it for a cleaning kit, and this mirrors that, storing the same type of cleaning kit here, or your last cigarette if you need to. The handguard was cut down to work with this, and we have a new upper handguard. So as I was saying before my battery died, we need a new upper handguard because we've moved the rear sight. It's now back here on the receiver bridge, and it's designed to kind of give it roughly the same sight picture as on the SETME. We have a 100-meter notch or battle sight, and then we have a total of 3 positions with peeps, 200, 300, and 400 meters, easily adjustable. We have a straight bolt handle, kicks up. It does hold open on the last round. And yet again, we have a spacer of a different pattern, but still the same idea in the front for the shorter cartridge. Otherwise, it's a pretty standard Mauser. Although, to my mind, there is one flaw with this gun we'll get to at the end. Moving back here, semi-pistol grip stock. Like I said, we have 2 sling swivels, a small one on the bottom. And these typically had a phosphate finish, like the Set-Me rifle. That's pretty much what it was. A Mauser playing dress-up, playing cosplay as a Set-Me. I don't know that these were ever really exported out of Spain. Most in America came directly out of Spain in the 80s and 90s. And I don't know how many were converted, but between this and the FR7s, plus the converted 1916s, quite a few. That said, I would definitely prefer the large ring Mausers, just to be safe, over the small. And it's worth pointing out that these are often row marked on the barrel by the importer 762 Set-Me. That's what they're often marked. Again, some feel there's no problem at all firing 762 NATO, even out of the small rings. Certainly no trouble with the large, but people differ. But certainly the most interesting and in some ways full-fledged conversion. And each of these has kind of pros and cons, so let's end by kind of really talking about that. While these are all Mauser actions, there is something I consider on a personal level a bit of a design flaw with the FR8. Some of you probably have already guessed it. Let me set these for just a second. It's the rear sight, specifically vis-a-vis the straight bolt handle. When you flip it up, where your fingers are at, depending on where they're at on the handle, you can knock the tar out of your hand. At least I can on the edge of this sight. And it's actually quite sharp and firm. Not a big deal, but I kind of wish the FR7's turn down bolt was more common than this. I just think I would find it a little easier. And generally speaking, I like turn down bolts more. Just something I really had to point out. See, now there we go. Took the bolt out of the Israeli. Full disclosure, don't do this unless you hit space, because these bolts are, fitted to their guns. I just thought it would be a neat little exercise. It's a little stiff going in, because again, it's not really bent for this gun. But see, when you do that, you're just not really going to bang your hand. Okay, let's have this over. So in terms of fit and finish, kind of which one feels the nicest, that to me is the Chilean. Part of it is that just old world craftsmanship that goes into the receiver and bolt. I mean, of mine, it's the smoothest. And it usually has nice blued parts or parts left in the white. And these generally have really attractive stocks. The Israelis have good fit and finish, but considering they're kind of put together from a mix of parts and went through service, it literally is a grab bag. You can get brand new FN guns, you can get clapped out World War II era guns that barely passed. Or you could have guns that were once in great shape and went to South America and Lord knows. The Spanish are kind of in between. Spanish arsenals consistency is kind of hit or miss, but these were built from new guns. The M43s were only about a decade old. They do have this nice phosphate finish, which does a very good job of protecting against rust. we are building them with new set-me barrels, so nice quality barrel. And so, you know, the quality overall is kind of in the middle. They're actually very nice guns. They all are. It's interesting to point out that these two have brand new barrels. The Israeli has a custom built barrel for this gun. This has a set-me type that's worked for this gun. And like I said, the rumor is with the Chileans that they were actually repurposed and reworked 1903 or 03A3 barrels. So in terms of the barrel, I would actually probably rate these the lowest, just based on the quality of these others, but they often saw less use than the Israelis, and sometimes even than the Spanish. So yeah, just in terms of fit and finish, personal experience only, the Chileans, plus just, you know, the craftsmanship. Now, if we're talking historical significance, just kind of the cool factor, we almost turn that on its head. As much as I like the Chileans, there's really no major notable conflicts or use of the 61 variant. Of course, the Spanish, while it was second line, there are photos and accounts of these being carried by the Guardia Civil, as well as kind of appearing in second line photos in the 1960s. They were around, even if they didn't see a lot of direct combat. But of course, as mentioned earlier, the Israelis, both in their original 8mm guys and in their 7.62 guys, they really saw use. And so from that point, plus you could have half a dozen of these and each one be from a different maker with different markings and stuff. So yeah, the FR8s and the 1261s are pretty standardized. Of course, there can be a little bit of variation depending on when the donor rifle here was made, but pretty much all the Steyr guns were made within the same run of 1912 to 1914. So yeah, the Israeli definitely has the most historical significance and interest. With that said, what about shooting? This may come as a shock to you, but I am not the best one to ask about accuracy. On the one hand, again, the Chilean, very nice quality, and technically it has the longest barrel. The Israeli is next, but sometimes these have rather worn bores, whereas most of the Chileans tend to have pretty nice bores. The Spanish has the shortest barrel, but then again, you really only need about 18 inches, sorry about that, for 308 7.62 NATO. On top of that, these have very traditional Mauser sights, especially the one on the 1912. It's a very small, very fine, a little bit bigger on the K98 inspired Israeli, but this has a peep sight. Much better for quick acquisition, easier to adjust, and even though it has a shorter barrel, we get a very respectable sight radius. So the sights, I would definitely say, are the best on the Spanish here. As far as, you know, things like sling attachments, the Spanish is pretty good. We've got the sidebar and the bottom small swivel, and then in the front we have the HK-esque hook, QD. That's good. The Steyr is kind of neat. We have a standard rear, and we have the QD, standard front and a QD in the rear. Certainly for sling, I'm going to give the to the Israeli. I know there's certainly a utility to this German style with the pass-through, but it's never been my particular favorite. You know, your mileage may vary. As far as the magazine box conversion inside here, we already talked about. I'm going to have to definitely give that to the Israelis. The way they did this, the spacer, the filler, it's more evenly done, more secure. It seems like it has a better feed ramp. Certainly a high quality job there, because these were built not as make work or to be pretty. These were built to actually be used, and it really does show. And these were built more to be carried by police, and frankly, I gotta say, look cool. And they certainly succeeded. This is one of the coolest looking bolt actions. The only other ones I'd kind of put up there would be like maybe the French CR39 or the Madsen. I don't know why, but the Madsen looks really cool to me. But yeah, neat gun. What about buying in the USA? Which one is the best value, and which one's kind of the safest buy? Well, it's not the Israeli. Again, these have an unknown history. The condition of the bore can vary greatly. Did they come directly out of Israel? Did they come out of South America? How have they been treated here? Because most of these were imported. I kid you not, some of the later century imports from about 15 years ago, they had literally bent barrels. Yeah, so keep that in mind. Some of them are pretty thrash. Some of them not. Some of them are in great shape. But very rarely will you find one of these unissued. And they won't typically be all matching just based on what they are. And they'll be kind of a mix of parts. And because of their historical notoriety, they tend to bring probably the most of all of these. So you're putting the most money on the line, and your chances of maybe getting a gun with a doofy barrel are the highest with these. That's not to say there aren't thousands in good shape in the country. Just, know what you're kind of getting, I would say. Moving from there, the Chileans, they are probably the least common of these, if I'm being honest. They usually are in decent shape. This one's okay. Some of them are almost new. Some of them are pretty well worn. Some are matching. Some are not. Some are missing some parts. Some are complete. So it's a little more variable, but not to the point of the Israeli. And they do sell for a little less than the Israeli, but the problem here is finding them. The good news is they take pretty well standard Mauser parts. Things you might find missing would be the rear swivel or the lock screws underneath, or of course the cleaning rod. And if you do get one of these, know that it takes a very short cleaning rod. That means that if you're just wanting a 7.62 NATO Mauser, your safest bet and the easiest one to pick up with little risk would be a Spanish FR8. These generally came in good shape. They're pretty consistent. You don't have to worry about the barrels on them unless someone in America did something. They typically are bolt and receiver matching, if nothing else. And they're kind of in the same price range, give or take, as the Chileans. Certainly less than the Israelis. Probably the best option if you want a good shooter, if I'm being completely honest, because of the better sights and just the neat factor, especially if you own a Setme. What a great companion for one of those. On the other hand, if you're a South American collector, there's this. Or if you're a Middle East or German or Israeli IDF collector, well, you do have the Mauser here. One thing I'll say about shooting, like I said, I do like turn down bolts, and this is the only one of these that seems to come standard with that. Of course, there's no hard and fast rule when it gets to conversions. But those are just kind of my opinions and takes. I think it's really neat that these countries found very practical and relatively affordable ways to keep these old guns in service, because even if some of them maybe had shot out 8mm barrels, these Mauser receivers are built for the long haul, as are the bolts. So they're still serviceable, and they kept them serving. One thing that just occurred to me before we go, as I was just talking about the cleaning rod for the Chilean, the Israeli, at least mine and the ones I've seen, there's not a hole in this Israeli-made stock for the rod. There's a groove under the bayonet lug, even a hole in the front cap, but it just leads straight to wood. So it's not missing a rod. It's just never had one. And of course with the FR8s, if there's a cleaning kit, it would be in this tube. If you want to remove the tube, there's a spring-loaded button. You can use a bullet tip. It just detents in and this just twists out, and you can check in here for a cleaning kit. There might be one that's typically a pull through, and these kind of beaded oil things, kind of like one-use oil things you pop open. Kind of neat. Kind of neat. And of course, these are standard Mauser type magazines, triggers, bolt internals, that kind of thing. So overall, all things considered, which is my favorite? I'm going to have to say the Israeli. But I think part of it is I like the large trigger guard in kind of the late style Kriegsmodel-esque barrel bands. And the crest is so deep that even I can tell it's there. And the history. But I really like all of them. The FR8 was actually the first one I picked up eons ago in a store, 20 some odd years ago. It just struck me as weird back then, and I just had to pick it up. And I've had a few over the years. Goes very well with HKs. Probably when someone wants to shoot a 308, a 7.62 NATO Mauser, it's the one I bring out the most because it just seems to get the most attention. But that's not to knock this 1912-61. It's definitely the most classic style, classic Mauser. They changed very little aside from giving it the shorter barrel and the rechamber job. It looks very similar to the original gun in 7mm. So if you're wanting one but wanting it to look traditional, that's probably your best bet. Like I said in the past, I've had a few come in the store. In hindsight, I kind of regretted selling them. And so when this one came in, I kind of squirreled it away. Could it be improved upon? Yeah, it's got a little bit of corrosion surface honest wear, but the stock is really nice. The action is very smooth. So I don't foresee replacing it, not unless just a super nice example comes along. But it's kind of in the same shape as the other two and matches them very well. Plus, you know, these are from different regions of the world. We've got Western Europe, we've got Middle East, and we've got South America. Pretty cool. But I just like that these can shoot a standard cartridge. While 308, some might debate, 7.62 NATO, perfectly safe. I would encourage you, if you do want one of these, to get one of the large rings. Again, in Spain, they did the 1916 and the FR7. Not that they're bad guns, but I would really look for an FR8. Likewise, for the Chilean, I would try not to get a 95 in this caliber. They're probably the most chancy of all of them. Now, I've never seen an Israeli small ring redone in 308, but I could be wrong. If so, let me know. But I just thought this would be a fun video to welcome the new gun in the collection. As always, if you could, please do like, share, and subscribe. And I'd love if you would share your own oddball Mausers in the comments below. It's always fun. And if you'd like to help support us, please check out the link to the Patreon page. This is Misha, and hope you have a good day, and I will catch you very soon next time.